Hi, everyone, and welcome to the comment section on Haps TV. I'm your host, Shivani Prasad, and I'm very excited to have you here today for this episode with Saad Amer. On the comment section, we debunk, explain, review, and answer questions about comments left by people on your favorite social channels. Are these comments true? Should they influence what you believe? We talk to experts to get you the answers that you need. Thanks for joining us today on the comment section. So just before we get started today, I want to acknowledge the white supremacist insurrection that happened at the U.S. Capitol on Tuesday. This was something that absolutely should have been expected after 4 years of lies and misinformation peddled by a president who directed these people to do exactly what they did. Any supporter of the president and these lies, especially his supporters in the House, the Senate, TV hosts, and journalists that also spread this misinformation, are all complicit in the violence that occurred. But that event took a lot of attention away from the Georgia Senate runoffs, which are still really important. So as we know, both Democrats, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, won their races, and we have Saad Amer with us to discuss this today. Saad is an environmentalist, activist, and the co-founder of Plus One Vote, an organization dedicated to improving voter turnout and improving representation in our democracy. Reaching millions, the organization rallies voters on issues like climate change, social justice, and voting rights, and has worked with the likes of Al Gore, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Halsey. He is an expert reviewer for the upcoming IPCC AR6 report, is on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Youth Constituency, and is an advisor to the National Parks Conservation Association. Saad, thank you so much for being here with me today. I'm just going to click you in.
Of course. Hello. Thanks for having me, Shivani.
No problem. So we're going to talk about these 3 comments. I'll just go through them and read them all first for our audience. Also, I just want to go through any of the comments. We have a lot of people saying hi from different places. Thank you so much to everyone who's tuning in right now. So the first comment that we have here, a reminder that 2 months ago, Lindsey Graham illegally tried to put pressure on Georgia election officials to throw out votes. The healing can begin when all beings like him are held criminally responsible for their actions and accessory to treason, full stop. The next one, and I just want to point out, Saad and I realized that these comments are likely from bots because, as you can see in their handle, there's a lot of numbers. But the reason we still want to go through them is because there are a lot of comments like this that are not from bots, and people are definitely thinking this. So we still want to go through it. But this comment says, so Dems won the House, Senate, and presidency, and we're supposed to believe it's all legit. Okay, this country is screwed. And the next one, the last one we're going to go through, says, well, we had fraud for 4 years ago, and now 4 years later, fraud again. When is it going to stop? The people need to take this country back and get the corruption out of Washington. And the news media needs to stop all the drama and report the whole story, not part. So, Saad, let's go through this first question here.
Yeah.
What do you know about Lindsey Graham's involvement in voter suppression in this election? And what can you tell us about the voter suppression that exists in Georgia in general? And I know that you and your team and a lot of the volunteers that work with Plus One have done so much organizing on the ground, digitally, online, to really help advocate for voter rights in Georgia. So what can you tell me about that?
I mean, of course. First, I want to give a huge shout out to all the Black women who've been leading the organizing on the ground in Georgia for decades. Feats like this don't just happen overnight. They take really decades to build up and organize. And I am grateful that Plus One Vote was able to contribute at all to that story. But, when we look at Georgia in terms of voter suppression, we really know that Georgia is ground zero for voter suppression, right? We consistently see it every election cycle. And we see it from every level of their government within the state, really, trying to stop people from voting, even having so much as just weeks ago, a case being brought up to stop the removal of 200,000 people from the voter registration rolls that were supposedly done illegally. So what we see is people constantly trying to remove people from the rolls in Georgia, constantly adding new barriers to get people from being able to register, from being able to physically vote, and just trying to put in as many obstacles as possible. And I think the reality is when you look at voter suppression, certain people win when you stop certain people from voting. That's just facts, right? And if you're a politician who's just out there for self-preservation and to continue your career, you just want to win. And so I think oftentimes we see politicians trying to stop people from voting. And what we've seen in Georgia is an entire political party really trying to stop voting from happening by their opponents. And I think that is unjust, that is unfair. And I think, what we're seeing right now with the coup happening in DC shows an entire system of people who are actively trying to really destroy the pillars of our democracy.
And what do you think about, and I just found this so, ironic that, I want to say it was yesterday, Lindsey Graham was really attacked kind of at the airport by a lot of people saying, recount the vote and all these things. And I feel like it's like, you asked for this to happen, right? And then you pulled out. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I think what we've seen is a lot of, in the past few weeks as the election results came out in November and those votes were being counted after. And then again for the runoffs, we saw a huge amount of confusion of even the messaging from the president himself saying, stop the vote, also don't stop the vote, stop the count, don't stop the count. And whatever it was in whatever jurisdiction, in whatever area, that would be to his advantage. And then again, we're seeing that same rhetoric now for the Georgia Senate runoffs and with the coup at the Capitol. And so it's not surprising to me, this insurrection. In many ways, this is what our highest government officials asked for. And so for this sort of condemnation that's coming out, and for these people to just be enraged and going after Lindsey Graham at the Capitol, it's not that surprising because in many ways this is what they asked for. They asked for this disinformation. They asked for this attack, and there was in some ways this thought that they would always be loyal to certain government officials. But this type of rage and anger and irrationality and white supremacy has no loyalty. And all it does is really break down our democracy. And at the end of the day, it comes down to impact and really negatively impact the lives of people like us.
Right. And let's get to this second comment, which again, Sada and I are very aware that it's likely from a bot, but we just want to go through it because there was so many other comments from, real accounts that were saying the same kind of thing. This commenter is insinuating that there must be fraud. It must be rigged because Democrats now have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. What are your thoughts on this? And on these claims of voter fraud in general, Sada, somebody who, so much of your life is dedicating to voting rights advocacy?
Yeah, I think what we see is a lot of people being angry that Black, Brown, Indigenous, and young folk came out and voted is just the facts. People always thought, people had no problem in Georgia when they didn't see this level of representation. And, what we're seeing even now in Georgia is them trying to actively stop absentee ballot voting from being done on such a large scale. We saw a record number of absentee ballots being cast in this last election, the general election, as a result of the pandemic, as well as this massive, massive interest in this election. And so, when I see comments like this that and we're supposed to believe it's all legit, yeah, dude, you are. Because the reality is, it is. The votes were counted, the votes have already been officiated, and you can't, just because you're not happy with the results, assume that it's not true. Every vote matters, every vote counts, and so every vote mattered and we counted them all, and this is the result. And a peaceful transition of power is essential, and I feel like we're seeing so much skepticism from the legitimacy of our government right now, and I think that's due to this constant dismantling of the belief system in what justice is in this country. We're seeing now kind of contradictory points of what justice should be. And when you have a fundamental disagreement of values like that, then trouble like this is bound to arise.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment here from Cameron. I'm just going to put it on the screen. I think voter suppression extends beyond one party or the other. Election officials in re-election campaigns desire less turnout from the other side. The elected officials are running against their record and want to drive less turnout due to insecurity of their own record. And then he asks, what about voter suppression of registered third-party voters? I had a friend in Georgia tell me in 2018 that third-party votes were dumped.
So, I think when looking at comments like this, first I'll acknowledge that, yeah, a lot of politicians do want to win and, will want more votes than their competitor. That's just the nature of politics. But I don't want to both sides this and act as though they're on both sides have been a constant attack to being able to count the vote or being able to have people out there and represented. What we've seen over the last several years really is an active attack on not just trying to get people out to vote for yourself, right? Like, it's one thing if you're a politician saying, hey, vote for me, this is what I stand for. It's a complete another thing if you're out there saying, oh, actually, the system is fake, the system is rigged, don't vote, go vote, only vote for me, and then actively trying to file lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit to try and dismantle the system. I think there is a fundamental difference, and I don't want to both sides this because there's no equivalency on how Democrats and Republicans have handled the situation over the last several months. And when looking at third-party votes, I think what we've seen is America become so polarized, overwhelmingly polarized, in a manner that, right now third-party candidates were just not really on the scenes as they've been in the past. And so, maybe going forward as we rethink and redesign our system, that's something that's plausible or possible. But right now, it has largely been an overwhelming focus on Democrat versus Republican.
I think also something that you and I have spoken about in the past is that we also cannot ignore like who these voter suppression tactics target, right? It is most often minorities and people of color. And so you can't really both side that either. In my opinion. We're going to go through this third comment. This commenter really believes that the media is at fault for not reporting this supposed election fraud. And I want to point out that this comment, although also probably from a bot, it also doesn't seem as if this person is trying to attack one side or the other. She's saying that there was fraud 4 years ago, and now that there's fraud again. So I'm assuming she means, when a Democrat won, there's fraud. When a Republican won, there's fraud. So I'm not 100% sure how she's going about this, but I would love to know what your thoughts are on this in the media, because obviously as well, the media is extremely polarized and definitely covering this in two very different ways.
Yeah, I mean, one, I'll say the idea of voter fraud is very much a myth in America. It's just consistently not a thing. It's like 0.00001%, like some astronomically low percent of the votes are voter fraud. And for the most part, when they investigate those are done on accident, really. And so, I think when people say voter fraud this, voter fraud that, it's just not true. It just isn't a thing. And that's just the reality, is the votes that are cast are legitimate, and we need to accept that as a reality. And when we look at comments like this that are sort of targeting the media, I do think that in many ways over the past 4 or 5 years, the media has been complicit in really allowing this type of polarization and insurrection of white nationalists to occur. And I think that's absolutely validated by seeing within the last 2 days, day or so, Mark Zuckerberg banning Trump from Facebook and Instagram, as well as him being banned off of Twitter, at first for 12 hours and then permanently now. And I think that goes to show how large of a platform that people who are inciting violence have. And while it's good that steps were taken to sort of reduce that harm now, what we see is, several years, half a decade at least at this point, of letting this sort of hatred manifest and fester to a point where we're literally seeing attacks on our literal Capitol building physically, but also on our democratic institutions as a whole. I think that it is despicable, and that the role the media really needs to play in this is ensuring that there is justice. I think there's a lot of talk of, oh, we need to move on, let's go forward. But we can't go forward until there's justice. You can't expect people to come together and unify and unite with white nationalists, with neo-Nazis, with people who just fundamentally disagree with your right to exist. There's no coming together with that. So there has to be justice, there has to be accountability. And until we get a real look at who we are, as America, nothing will change.
Right. And I also just want to point out, language is really important here. We need to make sure like you don't refer to these people as protesters. Even expanding the definition of terrorism is extremely harmful to some minority communities, especially Black communities and Muslim communities. So we really just need to call it what it is. These are violent white supremacists, period. That is what it is. We don't need necessarily more counterterrorism or anti-terrorism policies because that has been shown to harm minority communities more than anything else. So really, we just need to call it what it is. And that's what we need to fight in this situation. We need to fight white supremacy. So Saad, I really want to know, I feel like a lot of people have been, really distracted, obviously, from Georgia, even though it was a very close call in many ways, but still a huge success. So I really want to know from you, let's not forget what happened there. What do these wins mean for the future? And I know I see a lot of comments as well on Twitter of people saying that it's not really going to make a lot of change. So I would love to know what you think about that.
I mean, first of all, I think that Georgia shows what the power of organizing does. An entire state was flipped blue at really every level. And so, props to people like Stacey Abrams, LaTosha Brown, and St. Falk, all these other incredible Black women who really led that charge. And I think there's no denying how young people are looking at that sort of situation and saying, hey, actually, if we really do pay attention, if we really do go all out from TikTok to Instagram to whatever, to really organize, we can make a difference. And, looking forward at now the new makeup of the Senate, of the House, and the presidency, of how Kamala Harris, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, will be the deciding factor in voting for any policies that are 50-50 now in the Senate, I think what that shows is really the reality that change is possible. But what I don't want people to walk away feeling is that change is inevitable. Change is not ever inevitable unless we continue to push for it. Unless we ourselves are actively advocating for it, we shouldn't expect that these things are just going to happen. We shouldn't expect that legislation on climate change or healthcare or social justice or voting rights are just going to happen. The reality is our elected officials will push in favor the policies that we tell them are important to us. That's, for example, how climate change became to be such a major, major component of this last election cycle, because young organizers from the Sunrise Movement or the Future Coalition or even groups like my own Plus One Vote were really pushing to organize and make sure that politicians saw climate change as a major issue. And we have to continue that push for all those issues if we want them to be codified into law and if we want them to be as ambitious as possible. We can't just stop with little scraps here and there. If there is the ability to fundamentally push forward policies that will transform our country and really the world at this point, I think it's our duty to continue to push for those, to advocate, to organize, and to do everything we can.
Absolutely. This is not related, but I just want to post that somebody said, guy on the bottom, your eyebrows have the most perfect curvature. So that's just for you, Rod.
Thanks, comment section.
I'm putting that up on the screen. Also, I wanted to say we got a comment, and then one of our other commenters actually answered it pretty well for me. Someone said, and the BLM members are innocent. That's so one-sided and biased. And then one of our commenters said, as far as I can tell, BLM never planned on killing or holding government officials hostage. So you cannot compare these two things, you guys. Some people are protesting against their own rights, against members of their community being unjustly murdered by police, and other people are protesting a complete lie, something that has been pushed to them that they believe is true, that is not true. Literally a free and fair election. So we cannot compare those things.
Absolutely. And I think when looking at that situation in particular, I feel like we look at the Black Lives Matter protests, which, Plus One Vote, we actually helped support different Black organizers to, organize. Shout out to Freedom March NYC and their founder, Chelsea Miller, to be able to put forward protests for justice for Breonna Taylor or George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery. Or the list really just goes on. And, you look at a case like Breonna Taylor, who was shot, murdered in her own home. versus this insurrection of white nationalists who plan to kidnap our own elected officials, sitting in the desk of Nancy Pelosi and sitting with literal devil horns at the helm of the Senate. There's no comparing what happened between an unjust murder of an innocent Black woman to this violent insurrection, and currently seeing this takeover of social media of all these people who are actively trying to organize another coup on the 19th or 20th to interfere with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's inauguration. There is no comparison between these two things. And in many ways, we see that the roots of these two things are the same. It is white supremacy. And that is really what we as a nation need to very directly address if we are ever going to stop insurrections like this from happening again from white nationalists, and if we are ever going to get proper justice for the Black lives that have been murdered continuously throughout this country's existence.
Cameron also just wants you to address his last question. After we were talking about voter suppression, he said voter suppression does target minorities and people of color, but there are third-party voters who are suppressed too. Third-party voters can also be minorities, and I am a minority, and I voted third-party candidates before. So I think that was in regards to when he was talking about the voter suppression of third-party voters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, in my opinion, I think that America really needs to restructure its democratic system as a whole. I think that third-party candidates should be more viable and should be given more credibility in general. When you look at other democratic countries, there are a series of candidates and parties that then have to actively work together as a coalition. So there's constant negotiation, and that allows different types of policies to come forward and for everybody to have to live with the reality of what the facts are. What we see from our incredibly polarized system here in America is kind of people living in two different realities altogether. And so I do agree that voter suppression often does impact third-party voters. Obviously, both Democrats and Republicans don't have it in their own interest to see third parties rise. What we saw in this last election cycle is, people actively trying to remove third parties from the conversation. And, I think that in a proper, healthy democracy, every candidate should be, kind of heard at some level. At the same time, I think over the past 2 years, things have been so polarized that it was hard for a third party candidate to be viable at all. So, I think that there is a lot of discussion to be had on third parties in general.
Yes, and I did an episode about this with Alex Mahajer where we talked about the fact that third-party candidates we should absolutely be working towards that, but at the same time, with the Electoral College, that's extremely difficult to do. So once we work on abolishing that, then we can work towards having more third-party candidates and maybe even more than 3 parties. So Saad, what is the best way for us to get involved in voting rights advocacy, and how can our audience find you and find Plus One?
Well, lucky for all y'all watching that I run a voting organization. So if you are interested in doing more voting advocacy, more voting rights work, you can definitely join us at Plus One Vote. Our website is plusone.vote, or you can find us on social media on at +1 vote, as well as on Twitter, +1_vote. And, what we do is we organize massive campaigns on all of these major social issues, as well as on voting rights. So we highly, highly recommend that you come, that you join us, and that you organize, mobilize, and vote with us.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to thank you for all of the work that you guys were doing. I'm sure it was absolutely instrumental in what happened in Georgia as well. And, we've worked together in the past, and it's always been such a pleasure. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Shivani.
Everyone, don't forget, I put up Saad's information there on the side, but it's Saad Amer. I'm going to just put it up one more time for you guys to take a look. That is his Instagram. Thank you so much again to Saad for coming on the show. And don't forget, you can always send in any comments that you see that you want us to discuss on the show by DMing me on any platform. The comment section is live every Saturday right here on HAPS TV. Thank you so much for joining us from Mississauga, Ontario. I'm Shivani Prasad. Have a good day, everyone.